So I want to talk about the myths and realities of CAFOs today. I think it's important to understand to begin with that there is growing skepticism and concern among the general public today about our industrial, agricultural, farming, and food system in general, and CAFOs in particular. And CAFOs are really the epitome of this whole concept of industrial agriculture and the epitome of the industrial food systems. It's growing concerns. So if you want to check me out on that, just go home or go somewhere and Google on your laptop or whatever. Just Google the name of any of the major newspapers in the country, and along with that, Google CAFO, factory farm, industrial agriculture, something of that nature, and you see what pops up. And you will find that virtually every major newspaper in the country has had a number of news articles, feature articles over the last few months or the last few years that are dealing with CAFOs, industrial agriculture, the food system, and virtually all of those, I would say more than 95% of those, focus on concerns about industrial agriculture and CAFOs particularly. They talk about the environmental concerns, and with good cause, because agriculture is the #1 source of non-pollutants of the streams and aquifers in this country, of the streams and lakes in the country today. A major cause of the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico and various other places around the country that's growing today. CAFOs are a major public health concern. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention in the U.S., the World Health Organization, even the United Nations had a special summit on antibiotic resistance as a growing public health concern, and some countries treated it as a potential public health emergency. And all three of those organizations identified factory farms or CAFOs as a major source that's contributing to this antibiotic resistance. Animal welfare concerns are a big issue in all of the papers that you'll see, the newspaper articles around the country. California has just recently passed a law that the court has upheld now, that Californians will not buy it, or they won't be able to even stock in the grocery stores meat that comes from pork of animals that are where the sows are in gestation crates, or the eggs from chickens that are in the cages. And that's been upheld in the court, and that's growing public concern. There's legislation that's been introduced dealing with CAFOs and phasing out CAFOs, and so there's growing public concern. And as you heard from the introduction, what's been the response of industrial agriculture, the CAFO promoters? It's not to change what they're doing. It's to try to convince the public that we're all just foolish, that there's really no reason for concern, that it's always just the environmentalist or tree huggers or somebody is the only one that's concerned about these things. They have a major PR campaign. There was a nonprofit organization that looked at something like over a 5-year period, more than $27 million had been spent by the apologists for industrial agriculture to try to convince people that all of these things were nothing to be concerned about, and that CAFOs were just the modern day version of the traditional family farm. They argue that CAFOs are essential and CAFOs are inevitable regardless of whether you like them or not. So I want to address some of those myths here today. First, I'll start with CAFOs are socially responsible, or at least more socially responsible than the family farms that they so effectively displaced over the years. They argue that CAFOs are better stewards because they have these sophisticated manure management facilities today where they treat the manure and things of this nature in these lagoons or in the pits and that sort of thing. And they'll talk about how the family farmers let their hogs and chickens and things run on the outdoors, you know, where they would go across the streams and there was no controls on them and things of that nature. And they'll talk about the flocks of chickens that are out in the open are a bigger threat to spreading virus and spreading other things than when the chickens are all in houses and things of that nature. And they will argue also that in CAFOs, the animals are actually treated more humanely because they're in these climate-controlled facilities with ventilation and things of that nature, rather than having the hogs running out in the middle of the winter and outside and things of that nature. What's the reality of this? The reality is that CAFOs and industrial agriculture in general is destroying the hard-won legacy of stewardship and responsibility that was won by decades and generations and centuries of family farmers that did take care of the land. These aren't family farmers, these are industrial operations that are operating today. And if you want to look at the absolute statistics, the statistics are there that shows that we've had increasing environmental risk associated since we've moved to CAFOs. I can give you an example in the state of Iowa. Whereas we transitioned from the independent family farms in Iowa during the 90s to the 2000s, they've had a fourfold increase in impaired waters that are reported to the EPA during that period of time. Over half of the waters that have been tested across the state of Iowa are polluted today. In the areas of the state where they have the most CAFOs and the corn to feed those CAFOs, there's a recent study come out of the University of Iowa that shows that in spite of having all that manure from this area that's so concentrated, they're putting the same amount of commercial fertilizer on the fields there as if they had no manure. They're basically dumping the manure on top of fertilized fields, and it shows up in the pollution of the rivers and the streams as documented by the University of Iowa. So the environmental pollution risks are certainly there, and you heard about, the impact of having what the problem is you've got the equivalent of small towns and cities that are concentrated in one place without any form of treatment of the manure other than storing it in pits or storing it in lagoons and spreading it out of the line. What if we were spreading raw human sewage the same way that we're spreading manure out of CAFOs? When you had the animals spread out across the land, it's like people living out and having septic tanks or outhouses or whatever. If you don't concentrate all this in one place, you don't create an environmental problem that you have to solve. And as far as the inhumane conditions, living conditions are concerned, these animals live in environments like in the hogs. If those fans go out and they lose electricity, those hogs will be dead within hours. And the people that work in CAFO suffer health risk associated with just being in there for a few minutes. And how would you like to live there? And besides that, animals aren't meant to be confined. These animals are under stress when they're in there. And they argue, well, if the animals weren't healthy and content, they wouldn't be growing. But they're growing, and they're growing because they are under stress and because they're eating and because we market those animals at a very young age relative to their maturity, and we basically get them to the slaughterhouse before they get sick and they die. A CAFO is inherently an inhumane living environment for an animal that's evolved to created to run free and to have open spaces. What about the myths that CAFOs are necessary in order to keep food affordable? They talk about, oh, we've had brought down the cost of living, we have the cheapest food in the world, and we're necessary to keep it affordable. There was a major reduction in the percentage of income we spent on food in this country from about 19% in 1970 down to less than 10% in the late 90s. A good bit of that is because we had increased incomes rather than bringing down the cost of food, but there was some progress. But since the 1990s, for the past 20 years, overall food prices have risen as fast or faster, most of the time slightly faster than the overall consumer price index, and the price of meat, milk, and eggs have gone up faster overall. Of animal products have gone up faster than the overall food price index has gone up. This has been years whenever we've had the CAFOs and production concentrated under corporately controlled agricultural systems or corporately controlled production systems during that period of time. And any increase in the efficiency of producing at the farm level or lower cost of production hasn't been passed on to the consumer. It's been taken out to feed the corporate investors in the food system, the processors, the distributors, the retailers that are in between. And if you look at it overall, it's not the increase in efficiency or reduced cost of CAFO operations that are really causing people to adopt CAFOs, or the people that do adopt them, why they're getting more and more and the bigger and the bigger. It's the overall matter of scale. If you look at it from the overall matter of scale, even if you're making, let's say, half as much profit per head, let's say on hogs, or half as much on cows, if you can produce 3 or 4 times as many animals and you're making half as much profit, you as an individual are still making more money than you would if somebody else was in there. And so basically what they're done, they're in a position where they can force people out of business that are actually more economically efficient than they are, because what CAFO industrial system does, it simplifies the management process so that each of these investors out here or operators can produce more animals, can produce more milk, and so on. And so that's what we're seeing. And even if it is a reduction in cost, a slight reduction in cost, based on the research that's been done. For example, Iowa State University research indicated that even though in a hoop house system where it's deep bedding or where it's solid bedding and you can spread it outside and the hogs have access to outside in the summertime and things of that nature, it's more efficient in a hoop house system in the summer but less efficient in the winter. And they said overall about $3 a head advantage for the CAFO. Okay, let's take that $3 a head per head of hogs. And you take a head of hogs, a 285-pound hog will cut out about 150 pounds of retail weight. What do we got? We got 2 cents a pound. And if you got pork at about $3 a pound retail, you're talking about less than 1% difference advantage. But for the CAFO operator, it's a big deal because they can produce 5,000 head of hogs rather than 1,000 head. But for the customer, there's no benefit in it. And the customer ends up paying the cost in terms of health, in terms of the environment, in terms of the downside on all the things that I've mentioned here. Let's take the myth then that CAFOs are necessary to support rural communities. Boy, do you hear that in Iowa. Iowa's an agricultural state. All the rural communities are dependent upon agriculture to support the local economies. CAFO operators are responsible neighbors. They're good for the community and so on. That's the propaganda we hear all the time. In reality, industrial agriculture in general, and CAFOs now particular, are absolutely destroying rural economies and rural communities all across this country. CAFOs, industrial agriculture, by the very nature of it, is going to employ fewer people and it's going to pay them less than the systems that they are replacing. Why is that? Because the advantage of industrialization, specialize, standardize, consolidate, that's the process by which they do it. The basic advantage is that you standardize, you make that process simpler. You specialize so that you're only doing one commodity, one particular thing, hogs, chickens, one phase of production and so on. So you've kind of simplified that down. And now you standardize it. Once you standardize it, you can routinize it and you can mechanize it. And now you've got to the point where you can take fewer people. When you mechanize, you replace people. When you simplify, routinize the process, you don't have to have people that know anything. You can just tell them what to do. And that means that you can pay them less. And when you specialize, standardize, now you simplify the management process, as I indicated before, so you can manage many more units of production than you could before. So that means you've got fewer managers, managing bigger operations, paying fewer people less. Should we be surprised that we got fewer people employed in agriculture all the country? Not. It's just basically a fundamental fact of life as you industrialize. Unless something is growing tremendously during that period of time, you're going to displace workers and you're going to pay them less. You don't need to take my word on it. All you have to do is look at rural communities all across the country and you see what's happened to those rural communities over the last 50 years. I've lived through it the past 80 years, and I've seen what happened. It used to be prosperous places where people looked forward to a bright future, and it was a good place to live and a good place to raise a family and a clean environment. All of that's gone. The rural communities are withering and dying. They're not considered good places to live anymore. You look through the papers again and you'll see references to the rural ghettos, the rural-urban divide, because it's years of exploitation of rural communities in the process of industrializing agriculture. A recent piece by the Wall Street Journal did a survey and went back through the data, and they categorized different communities or different sectors of society based on things such as income, employment, ill health, early death, teenage pregnancy, drug use, a whole range of things. And rural communities ranked at the very bottom, below even the inner cities. The rural ghettos, that's what we've done to agriculture in the process of trying to make agriculture more efficient. Other things people will come back to and they'll say, okay, you may not like it, but that's the future of animal agriculture. That's the future of agriculture. Why do they believe that? I empathize with them. You know, I spent 30 years at 4 different land-grant universities. I actually got half of my salary for 7 years out of USDA at one point in time. I empathize with them. If you ask the people at the land-grant universities about the future of agriculture, what will they tell you? They tell you this is it. This is industrial agriculture. We're going to have more of the same. They will tell you about a future where we're going to go to, you know, smart production, or what do they call it, climate smart crop production. They talk about even more automated systems and things of that nature. Basically, their vision of the future is that farming will be done by robots guided by drones that are in the sky, with all done by computer programs. That's their vision of the future. So they tell these people that are building CAFOs and things like that, well, you're doing the right thing. That's the only way to stay in agriculture. They tell people, young people, if you want to stay in farming, this is the way to go. And also there's government programs. USDA supports this kind of agriculture as well. There's government programs, for example, if you want to borrow $1 million to build a CAFO, you can get someone to contract with, and they will go down to the bank with you, and USDA will guarantee 80–90% of the loan to build that facility, because you've got an agreement with that processor on that contract. And so you can go ahead and get into that. You know, they might tell you that once you've signed that contract, you're basically locked into that for the next 20 years. And they don't tell you that, and before those buildings are paid off, you're probably going to have to remodel them or rebuild them. You can borrow another $1 million and go, and by the time you get there, you probably won't be able to compete anymore unless you have twice as big operation as you have today, and you may have to borrow more. But anyway, so they tell you that's the future of agriculture. And they say, you know, maybe people in other countries become vegetarian or whatever, but people in this country are always going to want animal products, and there's really no viable alternatives to CAFOs. That's just where it's going to come from. And so if you're out here a young farmer today, you've got to confront all of that, because they're telling you that if you want to be on a farmer and you want to be in animal agriculture, this is where you should go. But in reality is, CAFOs could well lead to the end of animal agriculture in this country. That's what some of my vegetarian vegan friends are hoping for in Fairfield. But they're hoping we don't abandon them until they get rid of them, but I think that's not what most of us are doing. In reality, the whole industrial agriculture system couldn't survive without government support today anyway. We saw a good hint of that with COVID last year, when we saw that the government had to step in and declare emergency and reopen the slaughterhouses, because that whole system was about to be ready to collapse. We were in a period, if the government hadn't stepped in last year, our whole food system would have collapsed, because it's so fragile. It may be efficient in short-run economic terms, but as you strive and move further and further toward efficiency, you inherently lose the resilience, because it's all so tightly woven together. Our whole industrial food system basically works like an assembly line that starts with selection of breeding stock, and the process that goes through the system, production, processing, distribution. It's all like an assembly line. You throw a cog in any part of that assembly line, the whole assembly line shuts down. You got real problems in here. But it could be the end of animal agriculture, because without that government support, then it couldn't be held up. And then government support also supports the feed grain production, which keeps the supply going into all of that. And right now, we're in a situation where there's a major attack on animal agriculture. A lot of it is coming from the animal rights people, not just animal welfare people, but people that sincerely don't believe we should be eating animals. I think everybody has a right to their own opinion, and they see this as an opportunity, because there's growing concerns about CAFOs, and they're labeling that right across the board. And right now, it's the climate change that's a major thing. And animal agriculture has been targeted as the major thing that we can do to combat climate change, is just quit eating meat, particularly red meat. And what they don't understand, and what they're not looking at, is those concerns are associated primarily with industrial agriculture and focused directly on CAFOs. If we fundamentally change the way that we produce meat, milk, and eggs in this country and want to more sustainable productions of systems with agroecology and things of this nature, then we address those issues. We build a regenerative agriculture that basically has a regenerative kind of system that's not adding to carbon any more than it's taking down from carbon, because you're regenerating that whole cycle and the other elements as well. But if we stick with CAFOs, you can't deal with that. And the future of animal agriculture, I think, depends upon animal agriculture as integrated into diverse agroecological, regenerative, sustainable farming systems, which will employ more people, employ them better. You do away with the environmental consequences. You do away with the public health consequences, and you've got a fundamentally better system. Now let me deal with the myth you heard some about that CAFOs are necessary to feed the world. How often have you heard that? We got to have it to feed the world. There's hungry people in the world. We're going to have a greater, higher population in 2050. There's going to be 10 billion people on the earth. How are we going to feed all the people of the earth without CAFOs? The reality is that the rest of the world doesn't need and doesn't want CAFOs. Most of them don't. The reality is industrial agriculture is not feeding the world today. You heard some of the specifics in the introduction there today. 70 to 80% of the people, it's been verified by a whole range of international studies, 70 to 80% of the people in the world today are not fed by industrial agriculture. They are fed by small family farms, about half of which we would classify as subsistence farms. That's the reality of where we are today. Industrial agriculture is not going to those people because those people are poor. Industrial agriculture is driven by economic incentives, and those people do not have the income, do not have the economic power to compete with all of these alternative uses that we have for agricultural commodities today, so they're not getting them. And so they're producing food for themselves. The good news is that there are systems of production, and they've been validated by research around the world, not so much here in this country, but in research around the world, that show that these small subsistence farms can increase their production by double or triple what they're producing today without industrial agricultural systems. Basically with the kind of technologies that they were teaching in land-grant universities back in the 1920s and 1930s, which had to do with, we're finally waking up, restoring and maintaining the productivity and the health of the soil, integrating crop and livestock systems together so that you're recycling the nutrients. This basic biology, basic zoology, how to manage systems of animals and crops, education, just basic farm management is basically what they need. We call it agroecology. It's really pretty much back to the old balanced farming system in Missouri that Extension was teaching back in the 30s and the 40s. Create a farm that's good for the environment, that's good for the family, that will produce a good economic living, and balance those things put together. We know how to do that. The rest of the world can feed themselves. Ultimately, that's what they have to do. If we create this tremendously abundant industrial system that the people envision out here that's got these robots and drones and computer systems, you think they're going to feed hungry people? No, those operations are designed to make money. That's what they do. I'm not condemning a corporation, because a corporation is not a person. A corporation is something, I'm an agricultural economist, but a corporation is something that we created for the economic purpose of allowing people to pool their capital into larger units so we could accomplish economies of scale. The problem is we've gone way beyond the economies of scale, which was reducing costs through higher levels of greater scale of operation. We've gone beyond that now, and the corporations have gained the political power, have turned that economic power into political power, and they've gone way beyond what they're doing, and that's what's driving industrial agriculture into the future. Production on the small farms could be doubled, tripled. There's whole global movements in agroecology, food sovereignty movement across the country says people have a right to food. That's the only way we're going to feed hungry people, is when we agree as human beings that no one should starve to death when there's plenty of food in the world. And there's more than enough food in the world today to feed everyone in the world a healthy diet. We just don't care enough to make sure that everybody gets it. That's the key to solving the hunger problem. The one thing that we know will not work is simply trying to make food cheap. We have more people who are hungry or classified as food insecure in this country today than we had back in the late 60s. In 1968, CBS did a documentary called Hunger in America. At that time, the best estimate was that 5% of the people in this country were classified as hungry, and we called it a national emergency and had all kinds of new Great Society programs come in to feed the hungry. Today, and even before the pandemic, 11% of the people in this country were classified as food insecure, and 1 out of 7 of our children, 14% of our children in this country lived in homes that were classified as food insecure. We're not going to feed the hungry, we're not going to feed the world until we decide that we're going to take it on as a responsibility and not leave it to the market. The economic realities of industrial agriculture, let me read to you from a FAO report, Food and Agriculture report that was sponsored by them of the United Nations. It's put together by an international panel of experts on sustainability and food. And this is the conclusion of the report. They said today's food and farming systems have succeeded in supplying large volumes of food for global markets, but are generating negative outcomes on multiple fronts. Widespread degradation of land, water, and ecosystems, high greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity losses, persistent hunger and micronutrient deficiencies alongside a rapid rise in obesity and diet-related diseases, and livelihood stresses for farmers around the world. What they said is what was needed. What is required is a fundamentally different model of agriculture based on diversified farms and farming landscapes, replacing chemical inputs, optimizing biodiversity, stimulating interactions between different species as part of holistic systems to build long-run soil fertility, healthy agroecosystems, and secure livelihoods. They go on to say data show that these systems can compete with industrial agriculture in terms of total output, performing particularly strongly under environmental stress and delivering production increases in places where additional food is desperately needed. Diversified agroecological systems also pave the way for diverse diets and improved health. That's the reality of industrial agriculture today. And I'll end with this final myth. The final myth that I've heard over and over again, that basically that CAFO operators are like any other farmer. They have a right to farm. There's laws that are called right to farm laws. They give them the right to farm. And they argue that CAFOs and other agriculture is heavily regulated, and if they have a permit, they have to get a permit from the government to operate, and if they get that permit and they operate legally, that their neighbors have no right to complain because they are complying with the law. The reality is that the legal right to do something does not imply the ethical or moral right to do it. No one has a moral right to threaten the health or the quality of life of their neighbors or of society in general simply because it will make them more money. We simply cannot allow the right to do business to take priority over the basic rights of humans that are negatively impacted in their health, their well-being, their property value, and their quality of life as a consequence of that. We're going to play a shorter version of The Right to Harm here today, and I'm not sure whether this is in it, but I hope it's in this Elsie Herring from North Carolina, a lady from North Carolina that went back to a farm her mother had and got back there, and there was a CAFO built right close to it. And, and they were spraying the manure out through an irrigation system. And it was spraying on the side of Elsie's house. And she says in the video, she says, what gives any human being the right to think that they have the right to spray animal waste on another human being? Elsie is dead now. And nothing I know of that links her death directly to that cave hole. But I'm sure that it didn't do anything to lengthen her life either. And she spent her life trying to prove the point that just because that guy had a legal right to operate, he had no right to do what he was doing to her or the other people. There may be laws that say you have a right to farm, but there is no right to harm. It's time to tell the truth, folks. CAFOs are not socially responsible. They're not as socially responsible or as good neighbors as the family farmers that they have systematically displaced. CAFOs have not, will not, and will not keep food prices affordable. They will do whatever it requires to make money for their investors. That's what corporations do. Don't expect them to do anything else. That's what they do. CAFOs do not support rural communities. We have decades of evidence to prove that they don't. They destroy rural economies and destroy rural communities. CAFOs are not the future of animal agriculture, but they could well be the end of it. CAFOs are not necessary to feed the world. They don't feed the world, and they won't feed the world, and the world doesn't need them. And CAFOs have no ethical or moral right to continue to operate because there is no right to harm. Thank you.